I walked out of my own engagement party before they served dessert. And what happened in the parking lot that night gave me back something I didn't know I'd been slowly losing for years. My father's name is Howard. That's what most people call him. Not Mr. Werner, not sir, just Howard. He's the kind of man who shows up early to help set up chairs and stays late to help clean up, and he never once mentions that he's doing either. He worked 31 years in logistics, warehouse management, mostly, overseeing freight operations for a regional distribution company in Dayton, Ohio. He retired when I was 28. He drives a 10-year-old Ford F-150 with a crack in the dashboard and a dog-eared owner's manual in the glove compartment. He owns 2 sport coats. He cuts his own grass. I'm 41 now. I run a consulting firm that I started with a colleague when I was 33. We help mid-size manufacturers restructure their supply chains. It's not glamorous work, but it pays well. Better than well, honestly. And I've been careful not to make a performance of that. I live modestly. I drive a used Subaru. I wear the same watch I bought myself when the company turned profitable in year 2. My father raised me to believe that the clearest sign a man has nothing to prove is that he never tries to prove anything. I met Cassandra at a conference in Chicago when I was 38. She worked in corporate strategy for a private equity firm headquartered in Greenwich, Connecticut. She was smart, well-traveled, funny in a dry way that I liked. We dated long distance for almost a year before she relocated to Cincinnati to be closer to where I worked. I thought that meant something. I thought that meant a lot. Her parents lived in McLean, Virginia, the kind of neighborhood where the houses are set far back from the road, and the landscaping looks like it requires a full-time staff, which, as I later found out, it did. Her father, Richard, had spent his career in investment banking. Her mother, Vivienne, had never worked outside the home but treated the management of their social life like a second career. And from what I could tell, she was very good at it. The guest lists for their dinner parties included federal judges, a former cabinet secretary, 2 network anchors, that kind of world. I met them for the first time 8 months into dating Cassandra. Dinner at their home in McLean. I drove down from Ohio with a bottle of wine I'd been told was appropriate. A Napa Valley cab that the woman at the wine shop said was solid without being showy. Vivian accepted it at the door, glanced at the label, and set it on a side table in the entryway without comment. I didn't think much of it at the time. Dinner was fine on the surface. Richard asked me professional questions the way someone does when they're conducting due diligence, not having a conversation. Vivian asked where I'd gone to school. I told her Ohio State. She smiled and moved on quickly. They asked about my parents, where they lived, what my father had done for work. I told them. My father was retired. He'd worked in warehouse logistics. He and my mother lived in Dayton in the same house they'd bought in 1987. Vivian said, "How nice," in a way that meant the opposite. I noticed it. I filed it away. Cassandra and I got engaged 7 months later. A small proposal, just the 2 of us, at a restaurant in Cincinnati where we'd had our first real dinner, she cried. I was happy. For a few weeks, everything felt uncomplicated and right. Then the planning started. Vivian had ideas, many of them. The engagement party would be held at the McLean house. The wedding itself, already being discussed before we'd set a date, would be at a venue in Virginia horse country that Vivian had apparently already toured. The guest list, as outlined in a document Vivian emailed to Cassandra within 2 weeks of our engagement, had 430 names on it. I recognized maybe 11 of them. My parents were not assigned seats at the main table for the engagement party. They were placed at a table near the back of the tent, the outdoor tent that Vivian had rented and had decorated with what she called an editorial floral concept, which as far as I could tell meant flowers that cost a lot and didn't look like flowers. I found this out when Cassandra showed me the seating chart. I asked about it. She said the front tables were reserved for family. I said my parents are family. She said, "You know what I mean." I let it go. I shouldn't have, but I did. The party was on a Saturday in October. The weather was perfect, cool and clear, the kind of fall evening that makes Virginia genuinely beautiful. I wore a suit. My father wore one too, a dark gray one I hadn't seen before. He looked good. My mother had her hair done. She was nervous in the way she gets nervous at formal events. Slightly too still, slightly too polite, watching other people to make sure she's doing things right. I hated that she had to feel that way. We arrived and were greeted at the door by Vivienne, who kissed Cassandra on both cheeks and shook my hand warmly and told my mother her dress was lovely, with the kind of emphasis that made it sound like a mild surprise. My father she greeted with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite make it to her eyes. She directed us toward the bar and moved on immediately. The party moved the way those parties do. Cocktail hour, then dinner under the tent. A lot of people I didn't know talking to each other across me and around me. I made conversation. I was fine at it, but I was aware the whole time of my parents at the back table, eating with 3 couples I'd never met, and a great aunt of Cassandra's who appeared to be asleep. Around 9 o'clock, I was standing near the bar with Cassandra when I heard something. I wasn't meant to hear it. I don't think the man who said it knew I was standing close enough to catch it. He was one of Richard's colleagues, late 50s, expensive suit, the easy posture of someone who has never once questioned whether he belongs in a room. He was talking to a woman I didn't recognize, gesturing subtly in the direction of my parents' table. What he said was, "Which one is the groom's family? The ones in the back? God. You can just tell, can't you?" The woman laughed quietly, a private, confirming laugh. I stood very still. Cassandra was next to me. She'd heard it too. I looked at her. She had a slight smile on her face, not cruel exactly, but complicit. The smile of someone who finds something mildly funny that they know they shouldn't. She caught my eye, and the smile faded, and she said, "He's just like that. Don't let it bother you." That was the moment, not the comment itself, the smile. I excused myself. I walked to the back of the tent, to my parents' table. My father was listening to one of the couples across from him talk about something, a renovation project, I think. He looked completely at ease, the way he always does, the way that used to embarrass me when I was a teenager, because I didn't understand yet that it was a form of dignity, not obliviousness. I sat down next to him and said quietly, "How are you doing, Dad?" He said, "Good. The beef tenderloin was excellent." I said, "Did you hear anything tonight? Anyone say anything to you?" He looked at me for a moment. "I heard a few things," he said, "but I ate well, and your mother's having a good time talking to June over there, so I'd call it a net positive." I sat with him for a few minutes. Then I went back to find Cassandra. I told her I needed to talk to her. We stepped away from the tent, around the side of the house where there was a stone path and a garden that had been put to bed for the fall. It was quiet there. I could hear the party continuing without us. I told her what I'd seen. The smile. I didn't frame it dramatically. I just described it and asked her directly, "When that man said what he said about my family, what did she feel?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Miles, I love your parents, but you have to understand that these are my parents' friends. And sometimes people like that." I said, "People like what?" She said, "People who come from a certain world." I said, "My father built things his entire life. He managed a facility with 200 employees. He put me through school without debt and never mentioned it once. I need you to tell me that when someone implies he doesn't belong somewhere, that it bothers you." She looked at me with something that might have been frustration or might have been something sadder. She said, "Of course it bothers me." But she said it the way people say things when they're trying to end a conversation, not resolve one. I went back inside. I found my father and my mother. I told them I was going to call it a night, that I wasn't feeling well, and that I'd call them tomorrow. My mother looked at my face and understood that something had happened, but she didn't push. She hugged me and said to drive safe. My father walked me to my car. It was just the 2 of us in the driveway, the sound of the party muffled behind the house. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You all right?" I said, "I don't know yet." He nodded like that was an acceptable answer. I drove back to my hotel. I was staying in Falls Church that night, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning on the television. I called Cassandra the next morning. We talked for almost 2 hours, and by the end I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before. She loved me genuinely, I believe that. But she had spent her whole life in a particular kind of world, and somewhere along the way she had absorbed its values more deeply than she knew. She didn't think my father was a bad man. She just thought he was a certain kind of man, the kind you seat in the back. I didn't end things immediately. I want to be honest about that. I spent another 3 weeks trying to find a version of the conversation that ended differently. I talked to my sister. I talked to a friend from college who'd known me longer than almost anyone. I went for a lot of long drives. What kept coming back to me was not the comment from Richard's colleague. People say thoughtless things. What kept coming back to me was the smile. The small, private, sideways smile that Cassandra had when she heard it. Because that smile told me something about what she actually thought when no one was supposed to be watching. I ended the engagement on a Tuesday evening in November. I drove to Cincinnati. I sat down with Cassandra in her apartment, and I told her what I'd been thinking and feeling. I told her specifically about the smile and what it meant to me. She cried. She said I was wrong, that I'd misread it, that she loved my family. I believed that she believed that, but I also believed what I'd seen. I gave back the ring. She didn't ask me to stay. That, too, told me something. I drove home in the dark, 4 hours back to Dayton, and I didn't listen to music the whole way. I just drove. My father called me 2 days later. He'd heard from my mother who'd heard from me. He didn't lead with questions or sympathy or advice. He just said, "You doing okay?" I said I was getting there. He said, "You want to come over Sunday? I'm making chili." I said yes. Sunday was gray and cold, the kind of November day that Ohio does well. I got to my parents' house around noon, and my mother had the football game on in the living room, and my father was in the kitchen with the lid off the pot, stirring something that smelled like the entirety of my childhood. I sat at the kitchen table and watched him work, and I thought about how many times I'd sat in that exact chair, at that exact table, since I was old enough to sit up on my own. He didn't ask me to explain myself. He didn't say he was proud of me, not in those words. But at some point while we were eating, he said something I've thought about a lot since. He said, "You know what the thing is about people who have to make other people small? They're running out of room." I thought about that for a while. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "If you think your worth has a fixed size, then someone else doing well is a problem for you. But if you know what you're worth, really know it, then there's room for everybody." He went back to his chili. My mother changed the channel. The afternoon passed easily. I found out about my father's finances by accident, about 4 months later, in a way that he hadn't planned, and that I think slightly embarrassed him. I was helping him sort through some old paperwork. He was updating his will, and needed some documents organized, and I came across statements from accounts I hadn't known existed. Not checking accounts, investment portfolios, the kind that institutional managers handle. I sat there for a long moment. He came in from the garage and saw me sitting there and saw what was in my hands, and he had the expression of a man who was mildly inconvenienced but not particularly upset. I said, "Dad." He said, "Yeah." I said, "How long's has this been?" He said, "Long time." I said, "How?" He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table, and he told me. It was not a dramatic story. He had started investing small amounts in the early 1980s, when he was in his 20s, mostly in index funds, because he couldn't afford anything complicated, and didn't trust anything he didn't understand. He'd contributed steadily for decades. He had reinvested dividends. He had not touched the principal. He had lived within his means, always, because he genuinely preferred to. Not as a strategy, not as delayed gratification, but because the things that cost the most had never been the things he valued most. 40 years of that adds up. He wasn't a billionaire. I want to be precise here because precision matters and I am not interested in embellishment. But he was, by any reasonable measure, wealthy, substantially, quietly, permanently wealthy. More than I had known. More than most people who had dismissed him in a lifetime of interactions had ever suspected. I said, "Why didn't you ever say anything?" He looked at me with something I can only describe as patience, the kind that comes from having thought about something so long it no longer requires defense. He said, "What would I have said it for?" I didn't have an answer. He said, "I didn't want you growing up thinking the money was the point. The money's never the point. The point is what you do and who you are when no one knows anything about you. When you're just a man in a slightly wrinkled suit sitting at the back table. What you do then is what you actually are." I sat with that for a while. I thought about the engagement party. I thought about the man in the expensive suit making his assessment from across the tent. I thought about Cassandra's small private smile. None of them had known anything. They had looked at my father, at his truck, his house, his sport coat, his table placement, and they had placed him exactly where they thought he belonged, and they had been so completely, so confidently wrong, in a way that required no correction, no revelation, no scene, just time passing and them never knowing. That, I understood now, was what my father had meant about room. He said one more thing before we put the documents away and went back to the rest of the afternoon. He said it quietly, not looking for a reaction, just saying a thing that was true. He said, "I'm glad you're the kind of man who needed to know I was worth defending before you knew what I had." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I'm telling this now because I think about it more than I expected to. Not the money part. That still feels strange to think about. Peripheral somehow, like a fact about the weather. What I think about is the parking lot, the driveway actually. My father's hand on my shoulder in the dark, the party audible in the distance, and him asking if I was all right without any pressure behind the question. Just genuine, open asking. I think about the smile on Cassandra's face, and I think about what it cost me for a moment to decide that it meant what I knew it meant. And then I think about the chili and the football game and the table I've been sitting at my whole life. And I think about a man who spent 40 years building something enormous and never needed anyone to know it. My father is 71 now. He still drives the F-150. He cut his grass last Saturday. He has plans to fly fish in Montana in the spring with a friend he's known since the second grade, and he's been tying his own flies in the evenings, which is a thing he taught himself from a library book. He is exactly who he has always been. That was never the secret. The secret was that I'd needed a moment of something ugly to finally understand what I'd had all along.